Good morning, colleagues, and good evening to all those joining us today from Asia. I'm Madhuvanti Ghose, the Alsdorf Associate Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan art at the Art Institute of Chicago. Created in 1873, the Art Institute of Chicago is located on the homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Other tribes that are also indigenous to this area include the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and the Fox. Today, we proudly embrace our commitment to indigenous rights, racial justice, and cultural equity, not only through the statement, but also in our collecting practices, exhibitions, and programs, and with our relationships with indigenous communities. This acknowledgement also asks each of us to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. It gives me immense pleasure today to welcome Dr. Porchia Moore, Department Head and Assistant Professor of Museum Studies at the University of Florida, to present our keynote address. Dr. Moore is a critical race scholar interrogating the role and function of race in museums and the cultural heritage sector. Her curatorial vision is to be a story catcher and abolitionist. She is the co-curator of the Visitors of Color project. Dr. Moore speaks internationally on issues of race, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Moore has served on numerous museum and museum professionals boards and committees, and previously served as inclusion catalyst at the Columbia Museum of Art. She served as project advisor for Mass Action and was one of the founding architects for Museums and Race, and is project advisor and regular contributing writer for Inclusium. She has partnered with museums across the nation on education, training, and workshops on race and anti-racism in museums. As our AAMC President, Marianne LaMonica, just reminded us, there can be no better time than now to hear Dr. Moore speak to the AAMC conference as curators across the world take on the important task of ensuring inclusion, access, and equity in our own practice, and indeed acknowledging the AAMC's own dedication and commitment to its DAI work. I would now like to invite Dr. Moore to present her keynote address, Story Catchers, Abolitionists, and Dreamers, Curating in the New World. Dr. Moore, over to you.
Thank you so much, Madhuvanti. I just want to say that I've been so looking forward to literally this moment for this week, for the conference. I want to give a special thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you all, to Lucy Leiden, Judith Pinero, Marianne LaMonica, Casey Collier, and again, Madhuvanti Ghose. It is always, for me, really good to be in the company of fellow curators and museum professionals. And because of that, I want to honor and hold space at this time to the following. First, I want to acknowledge the land in which I reside. I reside on the unceded lands of the Alachua, Patano, and Temecula people. I also honor and recognize my own ancestors who came before me as enslaved Africans, who are now known as the Gullah Geechee people of the Carolinas, Georgia, and parts of Florida. I also want to lift up the following names of scholars, curators, activists, museum professionals who are literally cutting down big trees with the small axe of their voices, and to acknowledge that critique of museums is not an act of destruction, but it is an act of love and passion for this important work that we do. So with that being said, I want to honor and bring into the space the names of the following: and their work and their contributions to our field. I want to lift up the names of Andrea Montiel de Schumann, Latanya Autry, Dr. Kelly Morgan, Latadria Bouvier, all of the collective from the Death to Museums collective, those who are working with Decolonize Displace, what is now known as the Museum Equity Coalition, which includes the Visitors of Color Project, Mass Action, the Incluseum, Museum Workers Speak, and Museums and Race. I want to also acknowledge the hard work and labor to create equity, access, and inclusion of other entities such as the Empathetic Museum, Museum Hue, and all of the workers and contributors who are doing phenomenal work at the Smithsonian APA. I would also like to lift up the work of Dr. Aaliyah Brown and Adrian Russell and their contributions to this fight in hashtag Museums Respond to Ferguson. Also want to lift up the work of Latanya Autry and Mike Murawski with hashtag Museums Are Not Neutral. And then finally, I want to acknowledge the national mourning of all of those whose lives have been slain by the continued state-sanctioned violence of police brutality. So I feel really strongly that I can't begin my talk today without acknowledging those individuals. And then also I want to be really candid about who I am and sort of where I am. You know, I firmly believe that we are in a place of such great unlearning that it will behoove us to listen, to practice deep empathy, and to ask critical questions. So in my current work and in my current practice, what I have been relying upon is the work and the theories of my beloved Bell Hooks, who gave us in 1991 a wonderful contribution called Theory as Liberatory Praxis. And one of the things that I want to sort of begin today in doing is sort of framing for you how I conceived of today's talk. One of the things that Bell Hooks teaches us is that there is a kind of power. And she writes that the power of creative engagement, of theorizing and responding to our pain, a response takes place in the mind and heart, and yes, in the community as well. And one of the things that Bell Hooks teaches us is that actual learning often takes place in conversation. So it is my ask and my hope and my intention today that I'm going to speak less and then talk in conversation with you all. So my intention is to leave at least 20, maybe even 30 minutes for you all to ask questions, to drop comments in the chat, and for me to be able to be in conversation with you all so that real learning can take place. So that's the exchange that I'm looking for today. And then also I sort of devised today's talk, if you will, in thinking about it in the way that I kind of approach my work. So I'm someone who I love to make lists. I love to make bulleted lists, but in particular, I think in terms of questions. I believe that questions serve as a way to also teach us and show us the answers. And so today's talk is really designed as a series of questions and provocations. Again, so that at the end, we could be in conversation to have a really powerful, strong dialogue. So that's my invitation for you all today. I wanted to make sure that I frame that really clearly, that today's talk or engagement is really a way for us to ask critical questions, to kind of marinate on varying provocations, and to make sure that we are in dialogue with one another. And so because of that, I want us to be very intentional about the ways in which we dialogue. I want to make sure that we're dialoguing within this space, but I'd also like for us to be able to continue this conversation out into the world. So I'm asking everyone to please pull up your phones, access your Twitter account if you have that, and then join me in conversation, as well as invite others to join our conversation online. My Twitter handle is @PorchiaMuseM, and feel free to tag and share anything that you learn or that we will be discussing today. You can also use the hashtag AAMC 2021. So I want to kind of expound upon one of the things that Mr. Bunch actually somewhat articulated. And so, and one of the things that I've been really contemplating and thinking about is the ways in which almost everyone that I know of is talking about the ways in which the world feels new and that the world feels different. And if this is a new world, and for me, I will honestly say that the world definitely feels new and it feels different. What are we making out of this new world? Can we go back to a kind of new normal? I am a critical race scholar, as was mentioned before. And what that means is that we are literally looking at the ways in which we connect meaning and understanding by examining and interrogating the role and function of race in society, and in particular, the role and function of race within cultures and institutions. So as a critical race scholar doing this work within cultural heritage institutions, particularly museums, one of the things I'm really interested in is looking at and examining institutional and structural racism. So in this sort of new world, one of the things that I think was really interesting is that last summer, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is also a critical race scholar of education, really kind of helped put things into perspective for me. So one of the things that she argued is that we are actually all experiencing a collective trauma event. And if we are all experiencing a collective trauma event, one of the first things I would ask is that we are, first of all, kind to one another, that we treat each other with dignity and respect, and that we practice empathy as we all go about, again, this great unlearning. And so what Gloria Ladson-Billings tells us is that we are, in fact, experiencing 4 simultaneous pandemics. There's the global health pandemic of the coronavirus. There's the racial pandemic, where systemic and institutional racism is sort of being unearthed and uncovered, especially against the backdrop of again, our police-sanctioned state violence. We're also experiencing an economic pandemic as well as a climate pandemic. So again, I think it's important for you to understand that when I talk about this new world, what I'm also responding to is the state of affairs of the world. So what is this notion of the new world, and what does it have to do with curating? So many of you might have read Arundhati Roy's absolutely phenomenal essay about the fact that this pandemic is a kind of portal, that it provides an opportunity for us to make a new way. So Roy says that the coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And so I'm speaking to you today from the place of rupture. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And so I would offer and argue that we are in between worlds, and that this new world that we're in is the most wonderful opportunity for us as curators to create change. And so what I would offer is that in this new world, this is a kind of foundation for shaping change, but also creating the new worlds within our institutions as curators that that we can operate from, that we could advocate for. So one of the things I would like to argue is that in this new world, curating should take on this new shape. That the first thing that curating should do is increase 21st century literacies. So the Institute of Museum and Library Studies, IMLS, argues that there are a number of 21st century literacies. I'm not going to list all of the literacies, but I do want to maintain that as curators, one of our goals should be helping our visitors, as well as our institutions, increase the different types of literacies. And as curators, we should be making sure that our works, that our exhibitions are helping visitors increase their historical literacy, their visual literacy, information literacy, and also especially racial literacies. In addition, in the new world, our curating should look like making sure that we work with art and artists to foster critical inquiry. One of the things that I think all of us can agree upon is the ways in which disinformation and misinformation campaigns really helped us to understand that critical inquiry and critical thought, critical reasoning is not something that all of us, that everyone has. It's a skill set, it's a learned skill set that all of us must make sure that we are not only utilizing, but that we are encouraging in our curatorial practice. In the new world, curating should divest from learned practices which are rooted in white colonialist and imperialist ways taught to us in professional settings. Curating should work to support and sustain living artists who are consistently marginalized and preyed upon by systems of oppression. Curating in the new world should be a mechanism for speaking out against what Toni Morrison calls the master narrative. That narrative that, again, is predicated upon white ways of knowing, white normative culture. And we have seen, particularly in the US, the ways in which that master narrative is now being redefined and repackaged as a kind of educational patriotism. So we saw such resistance and pushback to the projects such as the 1619 projects, and in response, Donald Trump's 1776 Commission for Patriotic Education, which essentially was his way to repackage white supremacy and white nationalist thought as a kind of American historical record. I would also argue that in the new world, curating should embody a practice of transgression. So in my mind, as curators, we are not just curators, but we are also educators and teachers. And so again, I refer back to the work of Bell Hooks, specifically in her work, Teaching to Transgress. And I'll talk about this in a second. And then finally, I would argue that in the new world, curating should be deeply informed by your own particular allegiance to a practice. It should be a part of a practice. And what I have found in my professional experiences is that oftentimes curators are always sort of in tension with their own curatorial vision and the ways in which that vision does or does not align with institutional vision. So I would ask everyone to think about and consider, what is your actual practice for your curatorial vision? What is your curatorial practice based on? And how can you make sure that you live that out within your institutions, or even if you're working outside of an institution? So in going back to this notion of teaching to transgress, I would argue that curators must use the time that we are in now to create new curatorial practices. And so teaching to transgress, as Bell Hooks informs us, is a new kind of education. It is education as the practice of freedom. It is teaching to transgress against racial, sexual, and class boundaries in order to achieve the gift of freedom. That is the teacher or educator's most important goal. So here's one of my first critical questions. What is the role of the art museum curator in the new world? So I wanted to share with you what I mean by this notion of we can't go back to normal. Sonia Renee Taylor is one of our most amazing scholars and thought leaders, an innovative visionary who's helping us to understand, to basically to get free, to help us to unlearn all of these oppressive ways and frameworks of thinking. And Sonia Renee Taylor says that we will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was never normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. So I would argue that the role of the curator in this new world is threefold. That first, the role is to be a story catcher. That the second role is to work as an abolitionist. And the third role is to be a dreamer. So what is story catching? So I first discovered story catching in the work of Christina Baldwin. She has a work called Making Sense of Our Lives. In a project that I worked on with a historic house, actually. And I wrote about this work as a kind of case study in the book, Position Your Museum as a Critical Community Asset. And so what story catching is a kind of map making. It's a map that gets one person through, gets the next person through. We depend on story to learn from each other. I think as curators, we are, not only are we storytellers, but it is imperative for us to begin to not only just tell new stories, but to do the research, the groundwork, connecting with our own communities to making sure that we're uncovering new stories, even as we're hoping to even reframe stories. That story catching is a new kind of posture. That story catching is a way for us to catch a story by dismantling and disassociating ourselves from institutional authority. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So what does story catching require? Story catching requires less institutional authority and more relationship building, particularly with artists. It requires the ability to practice deep reflection and a willingness to use narrative to help shape new worlds of meaning and understanding. It is, as I said earlier, it's a new kind of posture, both an institutional posture and a curatorial posture. It's a way for us to catch stories, record them, and share them. Now I want to talk about the ever pervasiveness of whiteness in art museums. Who knew, the next critical question is, who knew we needed abolitionists in our museums? For the past several years, I've been really helping others to understand the difference between working in a museum and being an ally and working in a museum and being an accomplice. An ally is someone who mentally and intellectually understands injustice. This is someone who might share an article about some tragedy on social media, but who's not going to move towards an action-oriented step to actually facilitate change. Whereas an accomplice is someone who is going to be more action-oriented, who's going to send emails on your behalf, who's going to question authority, someone who's going to not only champion change, but be that change, who's not going to sort of passively sit by and share a link on social media. But more and more increasingly, especially after what we've seen over the last year, I've begun to understand that we really need to think about abolition work and the ways in which abolition work speaks directly to dismantling systems. And so a kind of base definition for abolition work includes providing models of community safety, security, mutual aid, and harm reduction that are needed, and to do the political education, relationship building, and movement work to bring others into demanding transformative economic and social change for abolition. So when I think about all of the names that I brought into this space before, this vast international collective of museum workers who some people call activists, who are actually working to facilitate change in our institutions, I actually now understand in more nuanced ways the ways in which all of those folks that I name are actually abolitionists, and how all of us need to work together to change museums, particularly art museums, who are rooted in so much colonialism and hierarchy and privilege, that we really need to work on and lean on and work from within the frameworks of abolition. And what I wanted to particularly call out is the ways in which whiteness is the thing that is holding us back. So Ta-Nehisi Coates was able to produce a groundbreaking Vanity Fair issue that was called The Great Fire. And in that, Coates writes, "Whiteness thrives in darkness. It has to. It is fully permissible for 1,000 Eric Garners to be tortured to death in the shadows of the American carceral system, the most sprawling gulag known to man. And so evil does its business in the shadows, ever fearing not the heat of the great fire, but the light." And so the Great Fire is an homage to not only James Baldwin, but an homage to all of the protests and the fire and the passion that we've seen in our nation in beyond last year, but the last several years. To clearly see what this country has done, what it is still doing to construct itself, is too much for any human to take. So it was with the slave narrative, so it is with the cell phone. And I started thinking about all of the open letters that we saw in the last year, particularly open letters, resignations, blunders, and outrageous things that we saw from art museums, and the ways in which that great fire has already been happening in museums, and again, particularly art museums. So I wanted to change some of that language that Ta-Nehisi gives us, and I wanted to make it applicable to the American Museum. So just imagine and listen and understand the ways in which that great fire has already impacted museum work. To clearly see what this country's institutional and systemic racism has done to the museum worker, to the museum, to the curatorial vision of passionate curators, what it is still doing to construct itself is too much for any museum worker to take. So it was with the slave narrative. So it is with the cell phone. So it is with the open letter, in particular in our art museums. So if you haven't read, you should read Andrea Montel de Schumann's No Longer an Extremist. It's an open letter to all of us in museums, where she basically described her harrowing journey of working at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And what I found compelling as I conducted a lot of research, but also tried to do a lot of healing and unlearning myself as a museum professional, is to think about the strategy of the open letter and how that open letter really, again, created a great fire, helped to add to the great fire of the work that needed to be done in museums. And the ways in which many of us are often afraid of fire. We run from fire. But I would ask you, what are the ways in which we could actually become fire starters? The ways in which we could actually learn from those ashes, grow from those ashes, and be nourished by those ashes. Andrea ended her open letter by, again, referring to The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And Andrea's words read like this: I do not think I have anything left to say at the time, but the words by James Baldwin in his book, The Fire Next Time, are compelling. It is an encouragement to imagine the opportunities ahead, to accept one's past when one's history is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. Thank you, dear, for everything. I am hopeful. And I wanted to share Andrea's last statement because we've seen so much critique of institutions. We've seen curators especially resign, say that they're leaving the field, that they're not able to continue to do this work against the backdrop of whiteness and white supremacy. And that's frightening, because what I see is an entire group of brilliant curators either leaving the field or having to document and articulate the level of harm that is being predicated on them as they're attempting to do this work that is not only brilliant and vital, but necessary. But I am inspired because Andrea says that she is hopeful. And so what I'm asking is for everyone to please remain hopeful, that if we commit ourselves as a collective to this work, that we can create healthy systems within our institutions, that we could all thrive, that we could all do this work and do it well with excellence, not only for ourselves, but for our communities. And so I've been thinking a lot about, documenting the open letters, documenting the resignations, reading different things. And I keep coming back to the incident that happened in Indianapolis at Newfields. And I keep coming back. I mean, I promise you, I think about this every single day. In that job listing, where it was asking for a director who will help the museum maintain its traditional core white art audience. And the reason why I keep coming back to this traditional core white art audience is because, do we not live in a new world? Do we not live in a time where whiteness is not our normative, that we are not living in a world that is actually a majority minority? And the only reason why I use that term majority minority is because we're talking about who actually has power. And so one of the questions, or some of the questions that I want to ask when I think about this notion of the traditional core white art audience is, who benefits from diversity? Who benefits from diversity? The benefit to diversity is for everyone. It is for everyone. And that when we talk about diversity, a term that, if you know me and you know my work, I absolutely abhor the term diversity because it is hegemonic. It is not action oriented. It actually means literally nothing in terms of the work of actual inclusion, the work of making sure that we are not operating from places of anti-Blackness, and the work of abolition work. Diversity actually has no place in these conversations. The questions that I would ask you as curators are, who benefits from diversity? Who told the white audience that they were at the center? And isn't it clear by now that peppering your visitorship is an act of violence? Isn't it clear by now that institutional racism and the pervasiveness of whiteness is the single most violent threat to the success of our museums? And don't we all want to do better? Don't we all want to be better? And can't we all aim higher? So quickly before I end, because I do want to have time for the questions, I wanted to just very quickly talk about my own curatorial practice. So again, I see myself as a story catcher. I see myself now moving into what I now understand is abolition work. Previously, I called myself a museum activist. Now I understand that really what I'm working towards is abolition work so that we can literally all be free of oppression and systemic racism. But so I want to talk about, and also my role is that of a dreamer. Those are my identities. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about my own curatorial work. So I'm currently literally working on co-creating 2 exhibitions. One exhibition is in partnership with my local city governance. The other exhibition is co-created with my amazing collaborators at the Harn Museum of Art at the University of Florida. So the first exhibition is an exhibition that is a kind of retrospective that is looking at the work of a local folk artist by the name of Aileen Harris. Miss Harris is a beautiful soul and a beautiful spirit. She's a self-taught artist who at one time her work was being snapped up by lots of famous actors and museums. People were not paying her well for her art, but yet she, in some ways, has been canonized. But she's also impoverished. And so one of the things that I wanted to advocate for on her behalf is that we, as in myself and the other my other co-creator, are not telling her story for her. So I made sure that I advocated that we found the money and the opportunity and made the means to do a short documentary on her so that she could tell her story in her own words. So we could catch her story and record it and share it, but that we would not be the author of her story, that she would be able to have her own agency. And so we were able to do that. We also felt like it was very important for us to have some kind of restorative justice, because again, not only has the art world and others sort of consumed her work and taken advantage of her, but they have not paid her well. So we made sure that she is being compensated for her inclusion in this exhibition, and that we are in continual dialogue with her, that we're building a relationship and a rapport with her. And that to me is really, really critical. I did not feel like it was okay to tell this Black woman artist story without her being a co-creator in this process, but also that we compensate her fairly for her own labor. And then the second exhibition is called From Shadow to Substance. I'm co-creating that exhibition with the director, the curatorial director of photography at the Harn Museum, Carol McCusker, who's absolutely phenomenal, and one of my beloved, brilliant graduate students, Kimberly Williams. We came together as a collective because we wanted to see and lead institutional change at our university art museum. We felt like it was really critical that we went ahead and did that work. And that in this exhibition, which is our response to a quote by Sojourner Truth, who says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." So she's talking about her very own image and the ways that her image was being sold sort of intentionally to help fund abolitionist movement. But what we wanted to make sure is that we weren't just having an exhibition about Black photographers in the 21st century, but that we really wanted to ask critical questions about Blackness and the ways in which the Black image and the ways in which museums continue to sort of create exhibitions that perpetuate stereotypes and do not ask critical questions about even our own understanding of what is Blackness. We wanted to tell a different type of story, and we wanted to be in partnership with the varying photographers to tell that story. So my curatorial praxis is one of, it's one of deep inquiry, it's one of deep reflexive praxis, but it's also one where collaboration is key. So we want to make sure that we're supporting our artists, that we're in constant dialogue and communication with our artists, but that we're not only asking critical questions, but that we're unearthing new stories and new ways to tell those stories. And so the final thing that I wanted to sort of end with is the fact that dreaming is a big part of my curatorial praxis. In particular, the ways in which we actually dream in our curatorial collectives. We dream about not only possibilities, but we dream about shaping new futures and shaping new futures for our visitors, as well as our colleagues from within institution. For me, the reason why dreaming is important is it helps us to eradicate white imagination. And so I shared this quote from Venable, who was the now former director at Newfields, because I think it exemplifies the ways in which white imagination is so pervasive in our museums. Venable is quoted as saying, "The decision to use white had been intentional to show the museum would not abandon its existing audience as it worked toward more diversity." And I shared that quote to demonstrate the lack of imagination of a world that is inclusive of BIPOC folks, of queer folks, of anyone who is non-white, in such a manner that the notion that these two worlds could not exist, such that one group would feel that they would be alienated and abandoned. That to me is indicative that we are living in two different Americas, that we have two different realities and two different existences. And the reality is we have to eradicate the black and white binaries. We have to understand that when we shape a new world, if we take this opportunity, as Roy informs us, to use this as a portal to help us change a new world, or to do as Sonia Renee Taylor has asked us to do, to not return to the new normal, then we must be able to come together and dream and envision the ways in which whiteness truly and deeply holds us back from doing our real work, from creating excellence in our curatorial praxis. And my final note before I open it up for questions is I just want to say that there's power in using a dream space to envision and shape new worlds and realities. And again, that ashes can be nourishing. I would ask everyone to go to YouTube and look for all of the wonderful talks and conversations that have taken place over the summer with the Death to Museums speaker series. And I want to end with some critical questions for reflexive art museum curatorial praxis. How might we dream as opposed to hiding in the colonialist prisms of current curatorial praxis? What are the ways that curators can create and design to liberate themselves from institutional racism and structures? What are the ways in which art museum curators can center joy in their work? Because that's the thing that's important for me. When I shared Andrea's statement about being hopeful, for me, the hope is in the joy that we actually can find in curatorial work. What are the ways in which you can take action towards your own unlearning and create change from where you are? I would ask everyone also to read this work by Robin Kelly. It's called Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination. I focus specifically on Black radical imagination because, again, the ways in which there's not only a pervasiveness of whiteness, but the ways in which all of us including Black people, are subjected to the violence of anti-Blackness. And so the opposite response to that is to understand and operate from a dream space that is predicated on Black radical imagination. So Kelly says, without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Oftentimes, dreaming gets reduced to the individual process of envisioning something different. Dreams can have transformative impact, though, if we put in the work. And now I'd like to open up the floor for questions and to be in dialogue. And I share this picture of me because I'm a chicken lady and I raise chickens, and these are my beloved little baby chickens. All right, so I'm not sure if you all have the ability to unmute yourselves, but I'll look in the chat and look at the questions. So Daniel, let's see. Daniel asks, I too am interested in compensating artists fairly for their participation in our exhibition programs. How did you determine what constituted a fair compensation? So I will say that with the Aileen Harris show, we are operating within a budget. We do not in any way think that the figure that we gave her was a kind of justice, but we thought fair was fair was sort of calculated by the amount of time that we were asking her to contribute and participate specifically in the making of the documentary. And we're also working on other ways to care for her. So one of the things I sort of forgot to articulate is that we are also practicing community care. So one of the things that we have been doing and that we will continue to do is to give her art supplies, because that is something that she is in need of. So we make sure that she has art supplies, not to create towards the body of our show, but so that she can continue her art praxis. We did have a lot of conversations about what that amount is. We are continuing to work on to think about the ways in which we can continue to contribute to her financially. But we didn't just sort of drop a figure down. We had lots of really critical discussions about it. Anonymous attendee, I'm happy to share my slides. Yes, I get pushback from museums all the time. It is to be expected to get pushback. This is why earlier in my journey, I advocated that particularly if you are a BIPOC or marginalized identity and you're working in an institution and you are committed to this work, one of the things I will ask you to do is to access and download the Mass Action Toolkit. That is MASS. It stands for Museums as Site for Social Action. The Mass Action Toolkit is free and downloadable, but it acts as a guide for having these kinds of conversations. It was co-authored by a collective, almost everyone that I named earlier, a collective of museum curators, scholars, professionals who wanted to see this level of change across our field. And so one of the things that I began to advocate many years ago, again, especially if you're doing this work alone, is that you look for other accomplices, because you will burn out. Institution is designed to create safe spaces for institution. It is not designed for what's the word I'm looking for that kind of flexibility that change and adaptability that change requires. And so if you can make sure that you are working in a collective of accomplices, that work will not be easy in any way, but I think that it will help you to be sustainable. But yes, the level of pushback sometimes can feel overwhelming. But one of the things that we advocate for in our museums, in our mass action toolkit, is to continue to share resources, continue to, I mean, I hate to say this, and sometimes even force conversation and dialogue, and let institutions know that this is the work that everyone is advocating for, that this is an actual opportunity for institutions to lead, rather than kind of sit back idly. Yes, there is a lot of fear within institutions, which is why for me, I make it personal, right? Grace Lee Boggs, who was an amazing activist, said that before you can change the world, you must first change yourself. So I'm always in deep reflexive praxis on within myself. Again, I'm trying to be as clear as possible about my own curatorial practice, my own curatorial vision. And the way that I do that, though, is I center on the joy. I center myself on thinking about what is it that I actually love about curating? What is it that I love about working within museums? What is it that I understand about my why and why I do this work? So if you follow me, you know that one of the things I always talk about is that I got into this work because of my mother, who was an educator for over 30 years. And my mother was oftentimes in charge of organizing school field trips, but also she had a passion for art and history. So rather than me attending sporting events, we would make trips to museums constantly. This work for me is about a passion for culture and for arts, right? And so I say all that to say, I do this work for my grandmother who never went to a museum. I do this work for all the people who look like me within my communities, who need to see our collections, who need to understand who they are, who need to be able to ask fundamental questions about institutions like museums, and hold them accountable. But also, my why is for the benefit of the people, right? And so when I think about that, I mean, I don't I hope that I don't sound dismissive, but when I think about that, that for me at least erases that tension of running up against that fear. Looking for. So I'm gonna try to combine some of these questions because I have a hard stop, I believe, in the next 3 minutes. Um, So I see this question from Anonymous. I'm not sure where you live. It's a question about gender neutrality or the language of gender neutrality. How can you support and dream when the community itself does not want change? So again, I advocate to continue connecting. There's a collective of us across the globe. Connect with these organizations, with these thought leaders who are doing this work, share ideas, be in community, but also just understand that for many people, inclusion feels like oppression. And so oppression then sounds like it's not only, you know, fear and fear mongering, but it sounds like, what's what I'm looking for? That, yeah, you're just going to get resistance. You're going to get pushback. And what I would just simply advocate for is helping people to understand that we're living in a changing world, that inclusion, again, is for the benefit of everyone, and continue to educate. So that's why I really rely upon that work by Bell Hooks, you know, transgressing, to educate to transgress, because that is what is required of you in this work. As a story catcher, as an abolitionist, and as a dreamer, what is required of you is to help others to transgress. So whether it's your community, or, you know, in terms of like how you're educating your community, or whether it's in terms of how you're even educating your own colleagues, the goal is to help others to transgress. And that's why I always go back to those 21st century literacies, because as we have seen in the last 2+ years, there's so many literacies that many of us lack, whether it's information literacy, racial literacy, whether it's historical literacy, that to me, again, that's the goal of a good curator, is that we're helping to create and foster critical inquiry. So I think I have one more question that I can take. I'm going to answer Kat's question. Kat's question is, how do you not feel broken down? Well, I will honestly say, Kat, that there was a part of me for a second that I had to get off of Twitter because sometimes museum Twitter is filled with a lot of angst and critique. But again, I go back to my why. My why is about making sure that that museums are places of respite, places of beauty, places of learning, that people can explore within museums and help them understand who they are. Like, in my mind, it is about me really understanding why I'm working in museums. And so that feeling of like brokenness, or even bitterness, you know, that some people have, even like resentment, I temper that with my joy, because that joy is an act of resistance. That joy is my way of fighting back against oppression. That joy is the way of me drowning out all of those naysayers and all of those voices. And I'm not saying that it is easy, but it is definitely part of my praxis. And so I have to stop. It is 12:15. Feel free to email me at porchiaprojects@gmail.com or pmore@arts.ufl.edu. Again, you can find me on Twitter sporadically these days, because I'm working on multiple books and articles. But I want to just thank you all again so much for your listening, for your care praxis, for your community care praxis as well. Thank you all so much.